I am a visiting scholar here. I was a UC President's postdoctoral fellow for 2009 to 2010, and I'm finishing. So I really appreciate the opportunity to address everyone and talk about my research work, which I have changed the title. This is always happening when someone puts in a talk and then changes the title to make it more relevant. I'm focusing still on Carlton Goodlett and the Black Press in San Francisco. But the talk today will be from Jim Crow to Uhuru, African Independence and AfroDiasporic Emancipation in the Sun Reporter, 1957, comparing it to today. Okay? So we got some slides coming, technical problems here, but what I'd like you to see is the title slide, and then we have a couple more that are coming. And I'm focusing on the Black Press, so I have some examples of the Black Press. We're very familiar with these, but I always bring them for students who may not be familiar with the significance of it. This is the Savoy from when Barack Obama was just elected as a senator. Of course, it's got Michelle, and he, before they were the dynamic duo. When it became the President and First Lady, Essence, and several other magazines went to great lengths to cover them in full. So here's the Essence that covers that. And then I'll use one more. Crisis magazine, produced for over 100 years by the NAACP, always focused on black issues of political concern. Those are the generally some of the leading black magazines that we all look for, news and views and information. And people tend to think that those are more pop culture, let's say, targeted towards consumerism. But that isn't always the case in terms of what the Black Press has to offer. And the newspaper that I'm using today as my example speaks very much to both sides of that equation. What's black culture? How does it relate to our consumptive patterns? And also what's the political and social imperatives of the day. So the San Francisco Sun Reporter was published by Carlton Goodlett for over 50 years and was taken over by Amelia Ashley Ward when he passed away in 1997. And so it's still publishing today, and I thought I'd bring those also. I'd like to give you copies, but I can't, so please, at the end, just pass them back and I'll So again, the idea that the Black Press is simply here to promote pop culture or consumer habits simply isn't the entire story, let's say. Although again, we look at Ebony, Jet, Essence, and some of these magazines that sell a lot of black products, right? And consumer items, we tend to think that's the main thing. We're selling the sign and significance of blackness. But that is not the whole story. There's a hidden transcript, let's say. A story that is missed oftentimes by the mainstream press. And the example I like to use is when President Obama went to Africa. You know, he went to Africa twice. He went to Egypt, which they call the Middle East. And then a few months later, well, the very next month, he went to Ghana. When he went to Ghana, they said, oh, this is his African tour. Well, he'd already started it in Egypt. But that somehow was part of the Middle East and not part of the African continent. And so that's kind of struck me as kind of curious. It related to a story that happened more than 50 years earlier when Carlton Goodlett and others started focusing on the African independence movement, right? And trying to compare it to what was happening in the South. So here's the introduction, and here's the story itself. This is a cultural political analysis. Again, I apologize for reading from my sheet. I have some graphics for you that will be coming along. I'd much rather refer to the graphics and tell the story that way, but I'm going to use the printed word to keep me on track since I don't have visuals to show. So it's a cultural political analysis of how a Black American newspaper addressed conflicts between double articulations of race and nation in local and international context during a time in which civil rights and freedom movements from the U.S. to Africa were gathering momentum. The Sun Reporter, San Francisco's leading newspaper, black newspaper, was published for over 50 years by Dr. Carlton Goodlett, peace activist, physician, and a colleague of W.E.B. Du Bois. during this time, he used his newspaper as a social cultural institution to comment on political divisions and the potential unity between movements for independence and empowerment in the AfroDiasporic world. Of course, they didn't call it that back then, right? This is the term that we've developed over the last 40 years. This newspaper linked stories of the Negro revolt in the South, North, and throughout the West, drawing national, local, and international connections to Ghana's 1957 independence celebration and the international debacle around the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, right? Ghana and Little Rock. These two are seemingly disconnected, but they serve as vivid examples of how the quest for freedom and emancipation by Africans and Black Americans held international significance, not only for Afro-descended peoples, but for the United States and other nations that were contending for hegemony during the Cold War. So we tend to think of the Cold War as being this dampening period, right? Nothing can happen. Well, actually, people leveraged it to try to get freedom and independence for Blacks and African-descended peoples. They said, how can you attack Russia when we have Little Rock? How can you do that? How can you attack China, right, for being human rights violators when we have Emmett Till being lynched in 1955? So the U.S. and the government really wanted to silence that type of response. They sent Louis Armstrong, several jazz musicians all around the world as ambassadors for peace. Well, Louis Armstrong heard about Little Rock and said, you know what? You can tell that president he's nothing but a plowboy, right? And I'm not going to be his so-and-so anymore. Of course, he apologized later, and he went on the tour. But he, of all people, Louis Armstrong was upset by the contradictions that he saw in Little Rock and the fact that he was trying to be an ambassador for peace in 1957. So the cultural political lessons from 1957 can be applied to today's efforts by Black media institutions to elevate Afro-diasporic consciousness around the value and political significance of Black life in Rwanda and Darfur, for example, as well as the victims of man-made and natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina and the AIDS pandemic. That's the main thrust of where this paper is going. We tend to think of the Black press and ethnic presses as being ancillary to the real press, when actually they are breaking the stories that we need to know about. Black, white, Asian, Latino. These are the stories that don't get it into the mainstream. And when Barack Obama went abroad, that's what we saw. So let me get into the